Okay, so welcome everybody. My name's Dr. Dave Beck. I'm from the UBI Lab, Greater Manchester. We are part of an international network of 40 labs, most of which are geographically based in towns and cities across the UK. We're also accompanied by a national lab in Northern Ireland and in Wales. We also have 7 international labs: Bucharest in Romania, Jakarta in Indonesia, Den Haag in Holland, Washington DC, Iceland, Perth in Australia, and Buenos Aires in Argentina. We also have 6 non-geographic labs too. We've got the UBI Lab Youth Network, UBI Lab Women, UBI Lab Arts, UBI Lab LGBTQ+, and UBI Lab Disability. And our newest lab is the UBI Lab Food. Each of these thematic labs looks at the impact a universal basic income could have from the perspective of that lived experience. In terms of activity, they have lots of parallels with the actions and campaigning done by the towns, cities and regional based labs, but with the people, groups and organisations within those communities. So what is a UBI lab? I can hear you all ask. Essentially, a lab is a group of people working together to explore the impact a basic income could have on them and their community. The network is decentralised and each lab is autonomous, deciding what they do. We collaborate together, and with other campaigning organisations, we share experiences, knowledge and resources to help each other in taking action, engaging people and building momentum. All of the activities labs work on fit roughly into 3 categories: lab work, movement building and lobbying. Rather than advocating for a specific UBI model or amount, the network's focus is on trialling and testing the impact a universal basic income. That is equal, so significantly reducing poverty and acting to address lack of equality for individuals, communities, and across all regions of the UK. Simple in reducing complexity and the cost of the welfare state, making it more supportive and less intrusive. Democratic, allowing people to contribute to their community and amplifying participatory, deliberative and representative forms of democracy. Inclusive, ensuring that we leave no individuals or communities behind and listening to the concerns of others. Tonight, we're exploring how a UBI could impact the challenges we face and help transform Greater Manchester. So without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to our In Conversation host, the wonderful Joshi Herrmann, to introduce our illustrious panel.
Good evening, everyone. Great to be on the call, and thanks for having me along to host this. My name is Joshi Herrmann. I edit The Mill in Manchester. We cover lots of stories in Greater Manchester, but one of the big things that we cover is inequality. And one of the big things we cover is deprivation, and in particular, the areas of Greater Manchester where there has been a lot of deprivation. And I thought tonight what we could do, given that I'm not an advocate of UBI, I'm not a member of any UBI groups, I'm just a journalist who takes an interest in it. I thought what we could do is speak to our different panelists and find out what's their interest in UBI, how did they get into this, how do they think it could impact Greater Manchester. In the past 6 months, we've been doing a reporting project that's specifically focused on the areas and neighbourhoods in the north of Greater Manchester. So not just in Manchester itself, but also in Bury, Bolton, Rochdale, Oldham, where there is significant deprivation and where some of the benefits of Greater Manchester's recent growth are not being felt. And I thought maybe we could also, reflect a little bit on whether this kind of policy or a UBI style policy, or even a trial of that kind of policy could help. On the panel tonight, we have got Dr. Alex Culvin, who is a player relations officer at FIFPro, the Global Union of Professional Footballers. She's also a lecturer in sports business at Leeds Beckett University. We've got Andy Burnham, who is the Mayor of Greater Manchester and a former Labour minister, and who has expressed support for UBI or interest in UBI in the past. We've got Professor Maria Nedeva. She is the creator of The Money Principle, which is a brilliant personal finance website, and also a business school professor. And finally, we've got Louis Strappazzon, who is a member of UBI Labs Manchester, who are organising this event. He's an MA in political economy at the University of Manchester, and he's got some sort of personal stories that will help us to understand why this kind of policy is really attractive to a lot of people. I thought we'd start with Andy. And I suppose my first thing I'd like to ask you, Andy, is when did you first come across the concept of UBI? Was it already circulating, in your kind of circles or among policymakers when you were in government? And why do you like it?
Thanks, Joshi. Good evening, everybody. I think to answer your question, honestly, sorry about the background noise. To answer your question, honestly, I think it was Ed Miliband who first suggested it to me to take a look at it. And it was when I was in Ed's shadow cabinet, and we were talking a lot about these issues. So yeah, I mean, I got interested then. So I'm sorry, everybody.
We've got another fan of UBI on the panel.
Yeah, getting very excited about the idea. And then I guess ever since then, I've kind of got interested, and I think Ed looks at it in the book that he wrote recently called Go Big. But I was kind of thinking about it in the context of the work that we've done on homelessness in Greater Manchester. And the thing for me about UBI, Joshi, is the thing about it is, if you set people up to succeed, they will. If you set people up to fail, they will. And I think what happens in our country is the way the benefit system works, we set people up to fail. And the kind of way the housing market is at the moment and the interaction between the benefit system and housing, we're setting people up to fail. We saw with Housing First in Greater Manchester that if you kind of set people up without conditions and give them a home and support, they will recover and they will succeed. And for me now, I'm kind of really clear that if we take an approach where we are putting a firm foundation beneath everybody, we will set people up to succeed, and we will spend public money in a different way, supporting the costs of supporting success rather than paying for the costs of social failure. So I've come very firmly round to that view. I mean, obviously the evidence, I kind of feel that's instinctively true, but the UBI Lab here in GM, but obviously with the others around Europe, I just really hope we can build that evidence base to show that this is in fact right. I know it to be true. I'm sure it's true, but I'm interested and in the market for the evidence to prove it.
So when you talk about UBI, because you caused a lot of excitement in the UBI world a couple of years ago when you said this is an idea that needs to be seriously considered. You've obviously had a couple of years since then to, I guess, consider it and meet people about it. And I know you're involved in the lab network. So tell us a little bit more. How do you see it? What kind of version of UBI do you have in mind? Because there are so many different iterations of it, some that target deprivation specifically, some that are properly universal. Which version of it do you currently most believe in? And how practical would that be to trial and to implement?
Yeah. So I support the principle, but I'm yet, I think, to be sold on any one particular way of doing it. But I do think to succeed, it has to be universal, is what I would say. So the U in UBI matters. It is an idea whose time has come, definitely. And why do I say that tonight? Well, I think you only have to look at the experience that we've all lived through, the pandemic. I mean, what that has brought over here in Greater Manchester is the cost to all of us of inequality. Inequality, in effect, in the end, affects everybody, doesn't it? It's almost like the kind of the reversal of the spirit level argument that Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson put forward, that equality is better for everybody, which it is in my view, in terms of, we all benefit from a society that's more equal. Even people at the very top of that society benefit from a more equal society. Well, we've seen in the reverse of that in the pandemic, haven't we? That inequality affects everybody. So when people can't go home from work when they're ill, that has an impact on everybody. So I've kind of, that's why I do think it's an idea of now. And I'm open to the precise way of doing it. I think you can combine it with housing. So, the housing first idea, I think, is interesting in this context, because you could have a housing component of this that's not just about income, but is maybe about a right to good housing in UK law, to sort of build that foundation out. So, I do think there is possibility to look at that as well as part of the income level. But I'm from what I've learned about our work on homelessness, I think where you set people up to succeed. I mean, if you take an example, Joshi, let's take the example of rough sleeping. I've got a scheme in GM called a bed every night to support a person in a bed every night for a year. And bear in mind, it's the same bed every night, so we don't pass people around from pillar to post. Once people go in, they can stay exactly where they are and they can recover. The cost of that for one person a year is about £11,000 to £12,000, roughly, in terms of the way we provide that scheme. The cost of somebody sleeping rough on the streets of Greater Manchester is estimated by Crisis to be around £20,000, because there will be chaotic use of health services, A&E, policing time and criminal justice issues, mental. So, it's kind of taking that principle out to a wider scale, isn't it? And saying, if you support people up front with the right investment, a good, secure job, a decent home, a predictable income that is there for them every week, rather than people living hand to mouth and all of the kind of erosion of their mental health that comes from people not knowing how much they're going to earn from one week to the next. I think you get the benefits flow from that to everybody, from a society that has those foundations beneath all of our citizens.
Before I go to the rest of the panel, let me ask you one more thing, because I think a lot of people watching will be really interested in, a leading politician showing an interest in this area. Some people might think you're sort of flirting with a fashionable idea that is obviously very popular and which is sort of in vogue. Can you give us a little bit more on the practicality of this? You've worked in government before. You know how difficult it is to get any kind of changes to the benefit system or to social security through. Can you really imagine a world in which in this country there is any sort of universal basic income paid to everyone across the board in perpetuity?
Yes, I can. If you go back to the middle of the last century, people say, can you imagine a time when healthcare would be available to everybody? And I bet people might have struggled with that idea. I think modern politics, I think the reason why your question's a good one is because modern politics, in my view, has lost the art of being able to think on that kind of level in terms of policy intervention. It's become very headline driven, soundbite driven, pea shooter policies, in the words of Lord Kerslake. That's what they trade in these days. And so I think, my doubt would be the capability of today's political class to bring forward a reform of this scale. But I do think if you look at what the pandemic has revealed and what we need, I think you do need a world where everyone has got enough to cover their basic needs from one week to the next, therefore to secure their physical and their mental health, as I was saying before. And then if you had that, the resilience of your community's society as a whole would be enhanced enormously, and therefore much greater able to withstand the shocks that seem to be becoming increasingly common in the 21st century. So yes, I can. I mean, whether it's all provided through public money is one question, isn't it? You can do some of this through regulation of wages and closing the gap between what people are paid at the bottom of organizations and what people are paid at the top. I do think we've seen a culture of excessive pay at the top of organizations, public and private, for quite a long time. So I think you could do it through regulation. It's not all done through taxation and public spending. I think you could require employers to support with pensions, with housing. There's a range of ways in which you could do this, and much of it could be done through regulation. But I actually believe this is an idea that should appeal to right and left, because if you are serious about social mobility, if you really want kids from all backgrounds to be able to get on, you cannot have them in a situation where they can't access digital connectivity at home, or where they can't feed themselves in the school holidays. You know, basically, if you believe in those ideas about aspiration and social mobility, I think you also should believe in a universal basic income.
Okay, thanks very much, Andy. Let me go to Alex. Alex, if you unmute yourself, you work and lecture in the world of sport. Tell us why you're interested in UBI. How did you get into this idea of the basic income?
Yeah, thanks, Joshi. And I really was interested in listening to Andy's answers then, and some of mine will reflect this a little bit. I think first and foremost, the UBI idea come to sort of fruition in my mind as I was walking around the streets in Liverpool and working in Manchester and seeing the levels of deprivation just increasing year on year. Homelessness was on the rise, poverty was on the rise. Where I live in Liverpool, you know, poverty was through the roof. And I was getting really, really frustrated with the current political system. I was really disillusioned with what was happening. And I was really keen to read about different radical ways of reimagining our society. I come across a book by Rutger Bregman, Utopia for Realists, and he talked about UBI, something that I'd never heard of before. And it really just triggered a different way of thinking for me. And kind of like what Andy was saying, I guess, you know, we're in a situation in society now where poor people are demonised for being poor, but actually poor just means that you haven't got enough money to live in, and you've got people who are working 40 hours a week who still don't have enough money in the back pocket to survive, and not only to survive, to thrive and be able to contribute and have access to participation to society. And I suppose sport is one of those. I think, you know, access to sport is a fundamental right, and it's a right that's forgotten. And there's really intricacies between sport and mental health, sport and physical health, the NHS, everything is really, really neatly tied. And I think having access to sport as a fundamental right ties quite closely to UBI. And I think about my own experiences as a professional footballer. When I was really young, my mum could just about afford petrol to get me to training, to afford a new pair of boots. And I think about now, if she would have had a little bit of extra money per month in the form of a UBI, you know, we would have probably had access to more training. There was lots of players that fell through the cracks who couldn't afford to come training at Everton 3 and 4 times a week. It was like a really far bus ride away from where I lived in Egbert to Bootle. So I think all of these like little intricacies and experiences that you have now, when I'm in a position where I can talk from an experience point of view of what a UBI could do to society, it gives us an opportunity to reimagine how we see society, how we view poverty, and giving people a springboard and a safety net is something that I prioritised, you know, both in my research and also obviously as an individual as well.
And Alex, I mean, I was in Bootle recently, and you can obviously see in a place like that the effect that a policy like this could have. I mean, there are a lot of people in Bootle living in, you know, way below the circumstances that they should be. But you can also see how some of the problems in a place like Bootle, some of the social problems would not just be solved by cash. And some people, and I think in the trade union movement and elsewhere on the left, think, actually, if you were going to spend this much public money on something, it would be better to spend it on sort of bits of local infrastructure that can be permanent and that can really help people, rather than giving people essentially cash payments. What do you make of that? If you think about the neighbourhoods you've been talking about in Liverpool and in Merseyside, what do you make of that sort of objection?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting thought that I've been reading about quite a bit myself. I've just started working at a trade union, so I've been trying to educate myself quite rapidly about it. And the objection to UBI was something that I come up against quite recently. I think, first of all, you know, the infrastructure needs to be improved in society. That is, for me, it's not a binary choice between improving infrastructure, for example, or giving more money for people to spend. I think the thing what giving people money does, it gives people choice. So it's up to us then, it gives people autonomy, which I think people are lacking now in the current political and capitalist system that we live in. I think there is cause for objection, because I think whilst in one breath we think about UBI giving individuals more choice, that's completely correct. In essence, this is a very theoretical model. We haven't really seen it work in principle, you know, properly in a fully functioning society. We've seen very small pilots, and and seeing well-being rise, for example, through a UBI. But I think for it to work in practice, I think there will be, you know, some really difficult drawbacks and decisions to be made. But I think, yeah, like I say, I don't think it's a binary choice between spending on infrastructure and spending on a UBI. I think there's got to be a real radical overhaul of society. And I think UBI is not a silver bullet, but it's it's one option that we can use to think about and reimagine society.
Okay, awesome. Andy, maybe I'll come to you in a second just about some of these objections on the left, both from people maybe on the right of your own party, but also on trade unionists who don't always love this idea. But first of all, I want to go to Maria. Maria, if you unmute yourself, you run a personal finance website. A lot of your writing is about how to stay out of debt. And one of the big arguments about UBI is that it helps people who are currently on the breadline, who are falling into debt on ridiculous interest rates, getting themselves completely stuck in a debt hole, that this kind of policy might help them. Is that what attracted you to it, or was it something else?
Well, in a way. Now, most of you will notice that I have an accent. I'm originally Bulgarian. And although I have been in this country over 30 years, I still remember in 1990 trying to walk down Oxford Road in Manchester and not being able to because every 10 meters there was a homeless person begging for food. These people were not, probably some of them were using, but if you're on the street, what do? There is no hope. You don't have dreams, you don't have future. So what do? You escape your life. And how do you escape your life? By using. But that was not the point. These people were hungry. They were homeless. And I kind of have always believed, even back then when I was young, that it's wrong at the end of the 20th century for people not to have shelter and food, which are the basic rights, okay? Thomas More, in his Utopia in the 15th century, was talking about this kind of basic rights of people. So 4 centuries later, we haven't progressed at all. Mind you, don't get me on progressing in humanity. We haven't moved since the beginning of it, but that's another point. So then I got interested in personal finance, and especially, as you mentioned, debt. And it's very interesting because there is a lot of mythology around debt. So neoliberal regimes, like we've been living under since Margaret Thatcher, convince us that it's the individual's responsibility. You're poor, you're in debt because you've been irresponsible with your money. But then you look at the statistics and you realize that 50% of households, over 50% of the households in the UK earn below what you need for very basic living. So as Alex already mentioned, these people work very hard and they can't make enough not to have to choose between eating and keeping their houses warm. And of course, marginalized so-called communities suffer disproportionately from that. Single mothers, people who for one or other reason cannot work, people who for one or other reason, maybe cultural even, didn't manage to create the conditions for them to earn enough, like get the education they need, get the cultural contacts, because capital comes in different forms, right? It's not only education, you can be highly educated. If you don't have the cultural capital to interact with people, you're stuffed on the labor market, right? Sorry, you are disadvantaged on the labor market. So that is how I got interested in that. And basically, we from the Money Principle have published on basic universal income on other sites for quite a long time. In fact, my husband, who is a statistician, has been trying to model how this is possible for some time, and probably soon we will have something to publish about that. But the important thing is, I believe that UBI is unavoidable, not only for the reasons that Andy and Alex already pointed out, but also because of the nearly complete breakdown of labor markets at the moment. So basically, we are facing substantial groups of the population who have skills who nobody wants to buy any longer on the labor market. And I actually think that in Manchester and in the North, we suffer disproportionately from that. right? Although it will hit the City of London very powerfully very soon as well, because any kind of semi-manual job that can be automated is being automated, right? So what do you do? So it is kind of a very interesting question. The only way of this and serious social unrest is basic universal income, but basic universal income, universal basic income that really allows people to exist on this for some time. So thinking about it, it's not only universal basic income. We can't think about it only being about alleviating extreme poverty, stemming unemployment and underemployment. It is also about enabling people to change trajectory.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm just going to move on to Louis, just because I think we've got a certain amount of time allocated, and you express yourself really well there. Louis, you're a big advocate of UBI. You're involved with the Manchester UBI branch in particular, and you've got some personal experiences that particularly sort of led you to believing in UBI. Tell us about that.
Hi Yoshi, hi everyone. So yeah, I mean, I've been supporting UBI for ages. I say ages, but like 2 years, it's not that long. But it was last year where my support for it really cemented, and where I saw how UBI could really benefit students and young people. So basically, I just finished my undergrad. I'd already started my MA at University of Manchester, and basically I ran out of savings, didn't have much money. Obviously, it was still quite the pandemic. They were still in the very much in the middle of it, as we still are. But basically, I applied for the Living Cost Support Fund, and basically my experience of it was just highly means tested. I have to send in obviously a lot of bank statements, and it felt quite demoralizing. And lots of it was very just lots of documents and so on. And I wasn't too shocked that they rejected me, but I was surprised by the reason. And it was basically, the reason was that I didn't start the course with it was some like arbitrary amount, like £13,400 before starting my master's. And then that made me kind of think, well, that's basically saying that I don't deserve help because I didn't have enough money. But if you think about it, really, if I had waited to have that amount of money, I would never do a master's. And I purposely did a part-time master's so I could work. They didn't really take into personal situations. So yeah, I'm doing it part-time so I could work at the same time. But the thing is I was advised not to. I would normally work as a steward, but I was advised not to work because in person, because I'm extremely vulnerable to COVID. So there was all that, and there was other reasons why, it basically, as it often is, it's not the person's fault. And it kind of made me think like it's about, if they're kind of saying tacitly who deserves the money. And this kind of made me think like,
And also, I mean, there's the particular benefits that a basic income could have for young people, students and young people in general. Tell me what you think on that.
Yeah, so like the reason that so obviously young people, students need help, and often feel that they don't deserve it and stuff. But young people and students do, like everyone, have financial issues, and obviously financial issues create anxiety and stress and make it harder to study. And what's the reason? What's the reason of doing a course and studying? It's to get the most out of your course. And if you're anxious about your financial issues, then that's going to really impact your studying. And also, if you're having to work a lot, well, that also means you can't get the most out of it. I've known, I've got I know people who have, skipped meals and not eaten properly, just, so they can keep on going. And another one is something that I've realized recently, from speaking to a couple of my friends is there's a lot of pressure for like to get into a career straight away because you know the need to kind of figure your career out and to get an income. And there's no time after uni to be like, oh, you know, this also applies to young people in general, even if they haven't gone to uni, obviously.
Yeah.
Or like, there's no time to figure, hang on, what do I like
Really want
to do? And a UBI could give you that time.
Yeah, awesome. Andy, I'm going to come back to you for a second. You've obviously been in the Labour movement for a long time. You've got allies on both flanks, I suppose, of the Labour movement. There was a comment about in the last couple of years from Jonathan Reynolds, the shadow secretary in this area, pensions, etc. And he did not sound. He sounded lukewarm, shall we say, on the idea of UBI at conference. You also must know that people in the trade union movement are not a huge fan of it. What kind of conversations have you had with people in different bits of the Labour movement about this kind of proposal?
So of course, I speak to MPs and other friends in the Labour movement, and I'm actually a bit surprised at how much it hasn't sort of been taken up, really, if I'm honest, given that it is a sort of 21st century version of some of the policies that Labour brought through after the Second World War, isn't it? I think, I was really inspired listening to Alex. I mean, I really related to what she was saying about the way visibly we've seen stuff change around us in terms of levels of, well, not just, levels of poverty, it's inequality, isn't it? Because then when we think of the way some people are living their lives, there's parallel lives going on, isn't there? There's just the kind of gap is just huge now, isn't it? So I kind of, I feel that this is, the best answer to the mantra we've all lived with for sort of 40 years now, that the market will solve everything, that, the market will sort it all out. The market will give you affordable transport. The market will give you housing that it palpably hasn't, has it? So that approach really hasn't worked at all. And I don't think UBI on its own is if I be honest, obviously I support UBI, but it's linked to availability of homes for social rent, isn't it? It's obviously linked to, as we're doing in Greater Manchester, putting public transport under full public control. Those kind of policies are needed as well, aren't they, to sort of take the pressure off people, if you like. I suppose the answer is, and I'm making no reflection on Johnny here when I say this, I observed it in my time in politics. You might remember I tried to bring forward a reform of social care, and I still very much hold to what I tried to do as Health Secretary, which was a national care service, a levy on wealth, effectively, that people have towards the end of their life to pay for a universal social care system based on the NHS principle. And I just observe, and this is true of the Labour movement, probably is true of other political parties, there's kind of politicians in the modern era can't bring through reforms, I don't think, or they, the kind of climate in which they operate doesn't allow kind of reforms of this scale to go through. But then you've got somebody like Alex who's looking at us and something massive is needed here because this really isn't right or working. You've got Marcus Rashford saying something similar from, coming from his perspective. So I think it is a challenge given the way modern politics has gone, and actually I'm talking about no individual here, but it's operating at a very superficial level, and yet the problems we see around us are so much more deep-rooted and so much more structural than the answers that modern politics serves up. You need to look no further than the levelling up white paper today, and there's a lot of fine principles in it in terms of the language of it. People from geographical, postcode should not determine people's status in life, but it does, doesn't it? Dictates where you end up in life for the vast majority of people, actually. So I think it's a question of sort of modern political culture. I think, Joshi, if I was to answer your question, I would have expected it to take root more, but it's kind of it's hitting up against a sort of a politics that trades in a currency of smaller policies and sort of let's say, less serious, less substantial sort of ideas, really.
Yeah, that's interesting. We haven't had. We're just waiting for some questions. If you're in the audience, you want to ask a question, let's get that in the chat, and then we'll start dealing with those. Andy, while we're on this, let's talk about Greater Manchester specifically.
Yeah.
Are there any trials underway, or thoughts underway, or policies underway where you're even planning to, trial this in a small way, or find out whether a basic income in some sort of guise could be tried in Greater Manchester?
So honestly, no, because we don't have the ability to bring forward a pilot on our own without support from the government. But I think there are things you can draw on that kind of draw on the same principle. So it's that example I gave to you of housing first. I really think it is something that people interested in UBI should look at, because it's almost like the counterpoint to the benefit system, to universal credit, which is obviously tries to trade in this space with its name, doesn't it? But it's nothing like it, because housing first is unconditional. And I think this is the point about UBI, isn't it? It's kind of saying that the support is there, as Louis and Maria and others were saying. It's just there. It's what you need to have a good life as a person. You don't have to worry about that basics. It's just there. And Housing First does that, and it doesn't make it conditional. And when I went to Finland, I was really struck, because I went to look at Housing First over there, Joshi. They said that they brought through their Housing First policy out of recognition of the fact that the rules that we create for people in public service bureaucracies are often cause the cliff edges that cause failure. And that was where this kind of notion really landed in my mind about set people up to succeed rather than set them up to fail. And I do think we are setting them up to fail. So Housing First in Greater Manchester, I would say, is the thing that we could most point to say, this is a different way of thinking about housing, and it is getting different results. We have a good employment charter, which is obviously a bottom-up initiative where we're encouraging organisations to pay the real living wage alongside a whole range of other employment benefits, and that is gaining a lot of traction, actually. And we're increasingly looking at linking it to public procurement, giving a much greater weighting to social value in public procurement, and then saying that the good employment charter is a tangible way in which companies can demonstrate social value. So these are the things we're building out, but it's obviously difficult with the resources we've got to pioneer, to take forward a pilot of universal basic income in a particular locality, and it would cause other people in other areas to say, why are you putting all the money there and not helping us, kind of thing. So
yeah, we've had a couple of people in the chat ask about inflation, so I thought I'd kick this one over to Maria, given that you're our personal finance guru and you might be able to answer. One person said, would a UBI only exacerbate the current cost of living crisis with the potential to rise inflation, to increase inflation and prices? Someone else, Alex, that first question was from Archie. Second question from Alex says, would a UBI only exacerbate the current cost of living crisis with the potential to, same question. Maria, I'm going to ask you first. What do you think? Like, this is one of the potential issues that people have with the UBI proposals. We've already got lots of inflation in key areas of the market. Giving lots of people money across the board could potentially make that worse.
Depends how you give this money and where this money comes from. A lot of the inflation comes from the bad characteristics of fiat currencies. Right, namely how central banks print out money, and this is how it happens. But we have to think about something else. So anybody who sees this as free money shouldn't see it as free money, or money that grows on trees, kind of comes from printing money. Because if we restructure the way, as Andy has been repeatedly saying, the way in which the welfare state function, or we look carefully, because in terms of mythology, we're led to believe that actually a lot of money goes on unemployment benefits, but it's only about 2.5% of the welfare statements, I'm told. 50% of what we pay out is for state pensions. right? So if we look carefully how this balances out and who does what, if we change taxation and we go for housing schemes, etc., I don't believe that the inflation pressures will increase. And I'm saying I don't believe because this needs to be calculated and I'm not in a position to do that. But also we have to believe, and this is something Louis mentioned repeatedly, it's not only about people kind of not having money to spend. It is about the fact that in any economy, local or global, money is like the blood in your body. It actually gets the economy going. So people spending and exchanging money gets the economy going. And if you provide relatively poor people with money to spend, you gear up the local economy.
Yeah.
If you give it to the wealthy through tax allowances and stuff, they just pile it in offshore accounts.
Yeah.
So
I'm gonna cut you off there just because we've got, I think, about 15 minutes left, and I want to get through a few more questions. But thank you very much. We've got a question specifically for Andy. The Co-op Party seem keener on a UBI. How much can that influence the Labour Party? That's very much a question that I think only you can answer, Andy.
Well, I think they certainly can. I'm a member of the Co-op Party, proudly a Labour and cooperative mayor for Greater Manchester. I think a lot of the best ideas in politics grow out of the co-op movement. So I think there's a lot of potential here to keep working at it, is what I would say. I think most MPs would be instinctively interested. I think that if I'm giving people the honest advice, for people in Westminster, I'm just going to tell you how they will think. It will be, how can we kind of say we support this without looking like we're going to be branded as, kind of spending huge amounts of money that that will put everyone's taxes up. I mean, that's basically what they will say. And that's why I say it's the evidence base that's the key to this, Joshi. I mean, genuinely, if other labs around UBI Labs can kind of show that if you support people, set people up to succeed, it cuts the costs of social failure. That's the way to do it, isn't it? Now, really, that is the way to go at this, to kind of counter the fear that some politicians will have that they'll be completely destroyed in the Daily Mail or whatever. If they kind of, and it says like, mad policy that will cost £100 billion. Do you know what I mean? That's because that's what they'll fear. If I'm being absolutely honest with you, I just got sick of that culture of Westminster where that no one would think big thoughts because they were just kind of frightened of their own shadow, if you like, when it comes to sort of those things. And I was so alienated by the way they didn't support my social care plan. It really that was a kind of time where I kind of just like was sort of losing faith with it all. But post a pandemic, that you've got to sort of see what have we seen in front of us, the inequality and the different way people are living their lives, and what is true building back better, or to use that phrase, from a pandemic. And surely it's ideas in this territory, isn't it? So I think you've got to kind of anticipate why they like it in their heart, but their head tells them, oh, I'm not sure I can back this. You've got to answer the questions that they'll have and demonstrate how the upfront investment more than pays for itself because of the cutting the costs of social failure.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think you probably just answered a question that we've had by Becky Slack, which is selling this idea into a skeptical audience. Voters and policymakers will be key. How should it be framed so it's viewed as affordable and desirable by both sides? Which I think you've kind of given a good answer there too. But Alex, I wondered whether I could ask you, you've kind of made an emotional case for this, and based on your upbringing and people and the circumstances you've seen. But can you imagine anyone in your life who is not a Labour supporter or who isn't on the left? Can you imagine Conservatives who going for an idea like this?
I think, like Andy said, I don't think this should be like part of a left or right discussion, really. I think this has got to be broader, it's got to be bigger, it's got to think about reimagining our humanity. I think what's been lost probably in the Conservative leadership over the last 10 or 12 years, however long it's been, it feels much longer. I think we've lost our collective humanity. I think we've become very detached from seeing, like what Maria said, like homeless person after homeless person, poor person after poor person, like people like scraping by has become our normality. And I think like slowly but surely, after like a long period of time of this, I think people just accept it becomes normality. And I think that's where kind of the book's got to stop. I think for me personally, I think there's this emphasis on this wild productivity. And, you know, if you're, and I don't think social media helps this, like if you're really productive, you know, if you're in this 5 a.m. club, all of this real collective bullshit, I would say, that actually, you know, it detracts from what people are doing on a day-to-day basis. And it really makes people feel like less. You know, there's this meritocracy myth that exists. And I think all of these, all this rhetoric and these narratives that people are constantly getting fed through social media, through work, in every sort of facet of their life, is making people feel inadequate. And I think people stop, I suppose, having ambition. So I think, whilst I probably haven't directly answered whether I think a Conservative would say yes to this, I think there's got to be some Conservatives out there, certainly Conservatives that I know, who have got a sense of humanity and like Andy said, probably are just scared to say, do you know what, this is a policy that I can get behind and I can support, because actually if people have got more money in their pocket, it's going to boost the economy in very simple terms, if you're thinking of it like sort of as a right issue, if you like.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important for us as advocates of UBI to try and have that reach with everybody. I don't think we can make it as divisive as a left and right or green or whoever. I think this has got to be a real collective action.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Louis, I want to ask you a quick question. Unfortunately, you're going to have to answer it quite quickly, but you are a big advocate. You clearly would back trials in Greater Manchester and Sheffield, everywhere else. There's quite a detailed proposal for a trial in Sheffield. But one really interesting question we've had is, how would these trials be helpful in that they aren't universal? So they're not representative of the actual idea, i.e., I think who's asking this question? I think it's Sandra. Sandra originally asked this question, and someone else has asked about it. You know, is there really any point in doing a trial with 200 people who are unemployed in Greater Manchester, or 1,000 people who are, you know, in a particular circumstance, when actually the thing that we really want the answer to is, how would it work in the entire economy?
I mean, obviously, I'm not an expert on pilots, but part of it is you're still going to get results from it, because if they're the people who obviously need it the most, so they're the ones you need to essentially like test it on first, I guess. And it's all about continuing the discussion. Pilots continue the discussion, and eventually, you know, there's obviously only so many pilots you can do. But the more pilots there are, the more the discussion continues. And building on what Alex said, like the reason, you know, we've connected UBI here with Manchester Issues to show how it's not to show how it's not a left or right issue. Like it's something which connects and can help many different people in different ways, in different situations, through looking at different issues. I mean, yeah, it's not a right or left issue as such. I mean, Nixon supported it, and you got, you know, a range of different people on the political spectrum who supported it, which I think is really interesting, and that's where I think the power is. Yeah, gone off on a tangent there, but
definitely, no, that makes sense. We've got a good question here from Beth, who says, when do you think we could enable a small scale pilot here in GM? Or what do you think could enable a small scale pilot here in GM? I think, Andy, this one's coming to you. Couldn't there be a different route than needing government backing, e.g. housing association, university and trust foundation partnership to run a pilot with a group? Would there be value in piloting the impact on people, even if it wouldn't be testing the state mechanisms to deliver it? Could you imagine something like that, or some NHS trust getting together, or some universities getting together and doing a pilot in Greater Manchester? And is there any sign that that could be something that's on the horizon?
I could certainly imagine it, Joshi, and thanks for the question, whoever asked it. And I would ask, this lab of ours to kind of maybe devise one. I mean, why not put one to me? I mean, I'm open to any ideas like that. I think it might be, yes, potentially. Our NHS trusts could be as our anchor, anchor institutions could be part of it, or maybe more the GM housing providers. So we were lucky to have our housing providers working together, and actually they could do it if we were then to sort of think about how we could support tenants, particularly maybe working with a couple of enlightened employers, or so I'd be open-minded as to how you think we could do it, and if you could serve me up sort of a few options for a small-scale pilot. I think the key is prove the principle, isn't it? Is the key, and the principle of it, as I keep coming back to, is if you support people properly, you spend money in a different way, in a better way. You spend money on good social outcomes, not kind of picking up the pieces when things have gone wrong. So I'm open-minded, and I would absolutely welcome you to sort of kind of pull together kind of 2 or 3 ways of doing it that are in the, if you like, the art of the doable and the possible. And bear in mind, you can build up the income. I think it can't all be sort of direct cash, if you know what I mean. It could be a concessionary travel, it can be obviously housing support that's available, it can be an enlightened employer. So yeah, the answer, I'm really interested to see how we might build the principle through some small local pilots. So put some ideas to me.
Okay, well, that's a challenge for a few people who are watching. I mean, there is a really interesting proposal in Sheffield that Sam's just posted in the group, which talks about different ways that you could trial it in Sheffield, and it's costed it up and that kind of thing. I think I'm going to hand over to Dave just to say a few things, maybe talk about what's coming up for the group, and then I think we'll sign off.
Thanks, Joshi. Thanks to everyone who's joined us tonight. I think it's been a wonderful and a fantastic event. So for me, a UBI holds so much potential for our city, because to me, Manchester is not just this large city in the north that does great things. Manchester really is a world-leading city, from its industrial past to its more recent musical and creative present. We hope that tonight has been the start of something interesting for you, and also start something really big for our group across Greater Manchester. We're actively looking for new members to come and join our UBI Lab Greater Manchester. So it doesn't matter if about your level of knowledge about UBI or how much time you have. We have plenty of roles for everyone who would like to get involved at any level. We've got big ambitions as well, from campaigning, inspired by an incredible work which has been done in Wales, where there are 7 local labs and 1 national lab, and we've got the vision to replicate this by establishing labs in each of the 10 local authorities across GM. So we're looking for people from each borough to be a part of this fantastic movement, and we will be with you for every step of the way to try and make your lab successful as well. We also have several other ways for you to get involved. You can simply just follow us on Twitter. Somebody will post the Twitter hashtag in the Twitter account in the chat now for you to follow. And we would like you to encourage others to do the same as well. Or you could write a short, simple blog for us about your interpretation of a UBI for GM and the rest of the UK. Or you could also get involved with us fully, and you could also start a UBI lab in your own area too. So as the newly launched UBI Lab GM moves forward, we aim to be holding regular meetings as well on sectional issues across GM, recognising that Greater Manchester is this unique place in the UK, not just today, but in terms of its modern history as well. And with this in mind, future events will be held, and issues will be organised around this same sort of a format too. We'll be discussing these topical issues and how a UBI is beneficial to addressing them. So recognising the immense importance of things such as the creative industries of GM and the role that that's played across the world, our next event will be discussing the significant impact a UBI could play in supporting creative industries. So that's from art to rock and roll, and from poetry to acting. Parts of GM, we've led the way, and we feel that they have so much more to offer, and that a UBI is key to harnessing the success of this industry well into the future. So other events as well that we have scheduled for the rest of the year will include key policy areas such as immigration and UBI, homelessness prevention and a UBI. And we know how great Greater Manchester can be, and together we can really put the B into UBI. And finally, before we wrap up, I'd just like to thank Joshi for the great work he's done in hosting this, and I'd like to hand back to Joshi to close.
Hey, thanks very much, guys. Thank you very much for everyone for coming. Thank you to Andy. Thank you to Alex, Maria, and Louis for their thoughts. It's a shame we didn't have longer, but we're ending on time, and it's been a really good discussion. Someone just said on the chat, I think, great discussion. Really enjoyed that. I hope lots of you feel that way, and look forward to the next one of these. Good night, everyone.
Great. Thanks, Joshi. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.